Okay, welcome to Psych 236, Developmental Psychology. Today we're talking about Chapter 24, Late Adulthood, Cognitive Development. Remember that cognitive development has to do with the development of thinking and reasoning and memory and problem solving, that kind of stuff. And in late adulthood, well, things decline, okay, for a lot of people. So we're going to talk about these problems. Let's talk about the brain, because a lot of these declines have to do with the brain. Okay, the brain changes, is always changing, and by the time you get to late adulthood, which 65 and older, your brain has gone through some changes, and some of those changes are going to give you some problems. Okay, and one of the things that we have to be concerned about when you are this age is the atrophy of your brain. Atrophy means that it kind of shrinks, it wears down, okay? And you can see that the atrophy ranking over here from the lowest, the image of the brain on the left, to the highest atrophy ranking, the one all the way on the right. So the brain all the way on the right is the one that has the most problems, the one that has had the most atrophy. You can see it has, see the white part in the middle? Those are called ventricles. Those are gaps between the areas of the brain. The gap between the areas of the brain has gotten bigger. There's more space in the brain, okay, in that brain than in the one all the way on the left that has the lowest amount. So smaller ventricles means that there are less gaps, less spaces, and that means the brain has shrunk less in that person that's, whose brain is represented all the way on the left. So yes, your brain will age, will shrink and get older, and you'll lose some brain matter, okay? But some people will lose more than others. Your brain normally has spaces in it, ventricles, gaps filled with fluid. But as the brain shrinks, those gaps will get bigger, indicating that you've lost brain area. Okay. The more brain you've lost, the more brain area you've lost, usually the more the impairment. Let's talk about something called senescence. Senescence basically is a slowdown, basically, when your thought, your memory, your movement, a whole bunch of things slow down and become impaired. That's called senescence. Okay, it's something that you have to think about when we talk about late adulthood. Okay, so slower thinking, for instance, is part of senescence, and it's attributed to overall slowdown in reaction time. You just don't react as quickly to things when you're older. Your brain slows down. Its ability to think and solve problems slows down. Movement slows down. The brain has to communicate with the rest of your body and the body with your brain for you to move, and it slows down. And so movement can become impaired. Speech slows down, and so does thought. As the brain shrinks and becomes impaired and slows down, that affects all the other things. So you're going to experience, well, not everybody, but you're going to experience some senescence, some more than others. Your thinking is going to slow. Your memory is going to be impaired. Your thoughts will be slowed, right? Movement is impaired, right? That's all part of senescence. So neurotransmitter production is also reduced. Remember that neurotransmitters are these chemicals in the brain that allow neurons to communicate with one another. And when there's less of them, that means that there's going to be less neurons firing, okay? And that's going to slow down thought. That's going to slow down reaction time. That's going to impair memory. Neural fluid is also going to decrease. The fluid that's inside your brain, right? Is going to also decrease, right? Myelination, which is the fatty tissue around the axons of the neuron that makes signals travel faster, becomes thinner, and therefore that slows down the firing of the neurons. Cerebral blood circulates more slowly. There's less circulation. There's slower circulation. And these fluids, by the way, and this blood that's circulating in your brain are helping nourish your brain, helping oxygen reach your brain and nutrients and things like that. And when that slows down, that means that things will become impaired, okay? Smaller brains, the total volume of the brain becomes smaller. As you get older, when you reach late adulthood, your brain is going to shrink, okay? Hopefully not a whole lot. Hopefully you'll be among the lower ranking brains when we're talking about brain atrophy, but it will shrink somewhat. Your brain will actually weigh less. Gray matter volume is reduced in every part of the brain, and white matter lesions form. Lesions are like little cuts, little abnormalities, damage to the brain. Basically, there'll be more damage to the brain as you get older. Transmission of brain impulses is disrupted. It'll be slower, it'll be disrupted. Sometimes you won't be able to remember things, or you'll forget to do things. All kinds of things can happen. This is all part of growing old, okay? But it doesn't have to become, a large impairment. We'll talk about things you can do to slow these things down and who is more likely to be impaired than others. More about senescence in the brain. There are variations in brain efficiencies, okay, and how the brain works. Some people's brains work better than others. Part of that is genetic, biological, but it also has to do with health habits and with past health and habits, okay? The things that you've done, okay? For instance, have you stayed mentally active? You know, have you gotten an education? Going to college, going to school, that stuff is good for you. Even after, right? It's good to stay mentally active, to read and to solve puzzles, right? And to be both physically and mentally active. Exercise, diet, all those things matter for keeping your brain healthy. You need to stay mentally active. You need to read, you need to solve problems, right? And you do that, by the way, when you work, right? You're solving problems, you're doing things, but also when you read, okay? Whether you're reading on the internet or on a tablet or whatever it is, watching TV isn't as helpful. You're just looking at things and it's like the thinking is being done for you. But all of that is good for you. But also, exercising. Exercise keeps the blood flowing. More blood flow to the brain stays healthier. All those things. You need to stay both physically and mentally active even when you're older. You don't have to strain yourself too much, but you need to stay active. High SES correlates with less cognitive decline. SES means socioeconomic status. What that means is those that are wealthier will have less decline cognitively, less, senescence, less brain decline. And that's for many reasons. People who are high SES, who earn more money, who are richer, a lot of them have higher IQ. Some of them are well off because they have a high IQ and they have a high education and they're smart, right? So they are likely to have, they will also have brain losses, some senescence, but it will happen later in their life and it will be less noticeable. But those with more education are more likely to keep their minds active even when they're retired, right? And that protects intellect, that protects the brain. You need to use it or lose it, okay? You need to keep the brain active. You need to keep your body physically active as well. Those with more income and better jobs tend to be exposed also to less pollution. They tend to live in better parts of town where there's less smog, less pollution, less toxins, and they have better water, and that's where the wealthy live. There's a reason why it's expensive to live in those areas. They have better weather, less pollution, less toxins, all that stuff, right? All, the junkyards and the prisons and the power plants that emit pollution and the polluted rivers, all that stuff is going to be where the poor communities are. That's just how it is. Where things are better, that's where the rich people move to. And they do a lot to make sure it stays that way, because they have money to sue. And if there's a company that wants to build a factory there or a power plant or things like that, they sue like crazy to protect their environment. They tend to live in the more beautiful and less polluted areas. And that's the way it is. That's what you can do if you're rich, if you're wealthy. They also have better medical care, better health care, better doctors that live in better parts of town where they live. Guess what? We have doctors too here and they're okay, but they're not that great. They're not the best. I've, been to the doctor several times, and many times I can tell you that the care I gotten wasn't that good. Okay. But also they have better nutrition. They eat better, more nutritious food, more likely to eat things that are organic, that have less pesticides. And because they're also more educated and more aware of things, they're also more likely to exercise and know about the benefits of exercise and staying healthy in general. The poor will always have it worse when it comes to everything. That's the way it is. It's just they have less resources. They can do less to protect themselves. But there's still things you can do if you're poor. If you're aware of all these things, right, you can do things like exercise and try to eat healthier, stay mentally active, right, to protect your brain as well, because all these things will catch up with you when you get older. Information processing after age 65. So 65 and older, how does the brain process information? So there are losses when it comes to how your brain inputs information. So sensory loss may be undetected as the brain fills in missed sights and sounds. Yeah, your brain doesn't take in information as well as it did when it was younger, right? When you're older, right? You don't hear things as well. You may miss things when you're looking at things. Your senses decline. You may not notice this at first because the brain fills in the gaps. Okay, to you, you're not missing anything. Your brain doesn't like to see missing information. So it actually fills things in places where you fail to hear something or you fail to see something. The brain has a tendency to basically make up whatever is missing, and you think you're getting the whole picture, but you're actually missing some things. Interpretation of facial expressions becomes more difficult, right? Especially anger and sadness, all that becomes impaired. So you're not even as good at reading faces when you're older. You may not even know when people are mad at you or people are sad, okay? Or you have more trouble detecting that. That doesn't mean you'll be totally unable to detect it, but you won't be as good at it as when you were younger, okay? Understanding of speech may also be impaired by reduced hearing and visual acuity. You're not as good at seeing and hearing, and that will impair speech and comprehension and just your ability to understand language and use language. More about information processing, memory will also suffer, okay? And there are stereotypes that older people have really bad memory. And there's something known as stereotype threat that makes memory even worse. Stereotype threat is basically when you believe the stereotype. So for instance, like there's a stereotype that older people are senile, that their memories are bad. If you're older and you believe that stereotype, you're more likely to show memory problems because you're afraid that people are going to think that you don't remember things very well. And that means that increases anxiety, and that basically increases what we call cognitive load. It's harder for you to think because you're worried about that. And therefore you come across as less competent and your memory comes across as being slower. So suspecting memory loss can actually impact memory and make it seem worse. If you believe the stereotype, you're more likely to confirm it, okay? Memory loss can be normal, right? It's part of growing up. It does decline memory as you get older, if you get into late adulthood. But it can also be pathologic. It could also be a sign of disease, of illness, okay? But generally, explicit memory loss is greater than implicit memory loss. What that means is you're more likely to forget things that have to do with like words, what certain words mean, or forget addresses and phone numbers, things like that. Remembering that something happened, that's all explicit memory. Implicit memory isn't lost as easily. Implicit memory has to do with memory of emotions, how you feel about someone, knowing that you love someone or that you care about someone, and memory about movement. That's implicit memory. Okay, that doesn't fade as easily. But the explicit memory, remember facts, information, names, that kind of stuff, what you did, episodic memories, those are explicit memories. Those are more easily lost. Source amnesia may contribute to less analysis of information when elders cannot remember the origin of the fact. Source amnesia is when people remember something, but they don't remember where they learned it or where they heard it, where they saw it, right? That makes it so that you don't think about the information as much. It reduces analysis and thinking about the information if you don't remember where it comes from. And that, of course, will reduce your ability to just problem solve. Prospective memory is a type of memory that suffers when you're in late adulthood. Prospective memory includes the ability to quickly shift mentally among tasks. It involves remembering to do something in the future. So you're doing this, and you need to remember that after this, you need to do this other thing. That's prospective memory. It fades notably with age. It gets a lot worse with age. You start doing something, and then you forget, like, what else was I supposed to do? I'm remembering something. Or you're going to start doing something, and then you get to your desk or the bathroom, whatever you're going to do, or the bedroom, and it's like, why am I here? What was I supposed to do? Right? That starts to happen. It fades notably. It happens a lot with age, okay? And already, you can have some signs of that even before you're younger. I already noticed I'm in my 40s, and I already noticed some things like that. It doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes I go to the pantry, I open something, and I think, I was going to get something from here. What was it that I was looking for? That happens a little bit when you're younger. When you get older, it happens a lot, okay? It may be aided through routines. If you have a certain routine, a certain order in which you do things, then the effect of losing prospective memory can be lessened, right? If you know that you always get up at a certain time and you take a shower and do this and this, and you have a certain routine of how you go throughout your day. Remember, you probably retired at this time. If you have a certain routine, you always do things in a certain order. This is when you take your medicine. This is when you do this. This is when you do that, right? If you stick to a routine, you're more likely to remember what you're supposed to do next. But if you don't have a routine, you're more likely to forget. Working memory also suffers, in late adulthood. Working memory, remember, involves like solving problems, figuring things out, right? Like when you actually are writing, when you're solving a math problem, whenever you do anything, whether it's tying your shoe or you are fixing some gadget or whatever it is, you're using working memory, right? It's whenever you're processing information. So processing speed is critical to working memory. It's important that you can think quickly, but it's irrelevant for recognition. When you just have to remember something, then the speed at which you remember something is not as important. But when older people take their time and concentrate, memory does not fade. If people can take their time, right, to read, to write, to do whatever they're doing, if they take their time, then they will still do okay. Memory doesn't seem to be that much of a problem. But working memory, the ability to think and the speed at which you think, all that stuff reduces. Reduced working memory will inhibit multitasking. It becomes harder to do several things at once. Multitasking, basically, it's like when you're, like during this time, right, when you're trying to work, let's say, and, online remotely, while you're also taking care of the kids because the kids are not at school at the moment, right? Things like that. Or maybe you're trying to cook while you're talking on the phone, or cook while you're, let's say, reading, or you're, whatever it is, you're having a conversation while you're putting away clothes. You're doing multiple things at once. That becomes harder the older you get. The older you get, the more likely it is that you can only do one thing at a time. And by the way, research does show that women are naturally better at multitasking than men, probably because they get a lot more practice. Remember that men, for the most part, they go to work, they come home, and their day is done. Women have a lot more to do. Most of them work. They also raise kids. They're involved in the cooking, the cleaning, and that's a stereotype, I know. But a lot of women still do that. Husbands do help, but they don't do that much usually. They don't have to multitask as much as women. And well, the better you do, the more you do it, the better you are at it. And but it does fade with time, your ability to multitask. Control processes also suffer. Control processes, remember, are involved in, when you're basically trying to figure out what strategy you should use to solve a certain problem, right? Focusing on certain things, knowing what to do next. Those are all control processes. It's also called like executive function, basically, when the executive part of your brain that makes decisions about what to look at, how to do something, what strategy to use. Those are the control processes. Control processes are involved in the underlying impairment of cognition in late adulthood, especially the impaired retrieval. Basically impaired control processes will make it just harder for you to think, harder for you to remember things, harder for you to multitask, harder for you to figure out what strategy to use, how to solve a certain problem. Control processes include executive function of the brain, right? The part of the brain that makes decisions, selecting attention, right? What to focus on, right? What strategy to use and what action to take. All those, that involves control processes. And that gets worse with age, as everything else. Control processes will shift as analysis and forethought give way to reliance on prior knowledge, general principles, and rules of thumb. Let me explain that. As your control processes, the ability to focus, to use strategies, and to choose appropriate action, as that becomes impaired and becomes harder to do, what happens is people rely more on prior knowledge. Okay, what did I do before? How do I usually do this? Okay, that's what I'm going to do. General principles, like general rules. Okay, this is how this is supposed to be done. That's the general rule. Or rules of thumb. Like usually when you have a problem like this, you're just supposed to, smack the TV because it's not working. Rules of thumb are like shortcuts. It's like a kind of a rule, like if the TV doesn't work, smack it or something. Or if the the internet isn't working. Well, unplug the cord and plug it back in. Those are just simple kind of rules about how to solve certain things that old people tend to rely on because they're no longer that good at actually figuring things out. That's what happens. You develop simpler ways of thinking, more stereotypical ways of thinking. Stereotypes don't just apply to people, they also apply to doing things. When you do things in the same way all the time, or you use the stereotypical knowledge about something, when in reality, we know better now about how to solve certain problems. That's what happens as you get older. Your thinking and your ability to solve problems, all that becomes impaired. So you rely more on shortcuts that don't actually work or may not work. Cognitive tests. So what about testing people who are older? Cognitive tests where they measure the output of the 5 primary mental abilities. Remember the 5 primary mental abilities that we talked about before when we talked about the different types of intelligence and memory and stuff like that. Well, these 5 abilities, they decline with age, beginning at around age 60, according to the Seattle longitudinal study that we mentioned before. Remember we talked about how things kind of decline at around age 60, according to the study. Your ability to basically do certain types of things, right? Certain types of intelligence decline. Tests are normed and validated on younger adult output. How do we know that declines are actually occurring? Because they also study younger people and they see that they're doing better and they start to see a decline at around age 60, according to the Seattle longitudinal study that was done. We also need to talk about other things that happen. We need to talk about diseases and impairment of the brain that occurs during this time that can lead to a lot of these problems that we're talking about, memory problems and the ability to think. And here are some of these problems. Alzheimer's disease. Okay, Alzheimer's disease, yes, it starts with just simple memory loss and then progresses and then it gets worse and worse to the point where before you die of Alzheimer's, you can't do anything. Okay, that's a disease that impairs the brain. We'll talk about that a little bit. Vascular disease. Vascular diseases have to do with usually, blood flow to the brain and oxygen flow to the brain and things like that. Like having a stroke or things like that. Those are things that could also cause damage in the brain that will impair memory and your ability to think and, behave yourself, all sorts of things. And there are these things called frontotemporal neurocognitive disorders. That's what NCD stands for. These are neurocognitive disorders of the brain, basically, that impair thinking, that affect the frontal and the temporal lobe. They affect personality, behavior, and language. We'll talk a little bit about that. And there's other disorders that also affect the brain and will therefore also impact thinking and decision-making and memory and things like that. Let's talk a little bit about Alzheimer's disease. So abbreviated AD. So Alzheimer's disease is diagnosed in every large nation. It's something that is almost not inevitable, but it happens a lot as people get older. The older you are, more likely you are to get Alzheimer's. And it's diagnosed practically in every developed nation. They have people there suffering from Alzheimer's disease. Okay. The main symptom of Alzheimer's disease is severe and worsening memory loss. Okay. That's what it is. It's usually loss of memory. Okay. It starts out gradually, right? When you just forgetting certain words. Like, what do you call that thing right there? You mean the car? Little things like that. You begin to forget what certain words are that you should know, right? And you start forgetting things like that. And it gets worse and worse, right? That's the main symptom. Deteriorating memory, basically. Most cases begin much later, right? It doesn't usually happen early in life, but it begins later in late adulthood. And there's many genes that are involved. And here are some. SORL1 and the APOE4. There's a whole bunch of genes that are implicated in Alzheimer's disease. Diagnosis is not definitive until autopsy. What that means is that we don't really know if somebody had Alzheimer's until they actually die and then they look at their brain. They cut open their skull and they look at their brain and they see the plaques and the tangles and say, yep, this person definitely had Alzheimer's. You can have all the symptoms before that, right? And maybe it's Alzheimer's disease, or maybe it's something else. Okay, but there's some very obvious signs, but We don't know for sure until there's an autopsy, right? Until they actually examine the body after death, and then they can see, yeah, this person definitely had Alzheimer's. There's 5 stages of Alzheimer's disease, right? And of course, memory gets worse and worse as you progress through the stages. In the last stage, memory gets so bad that you lose basically all memories. You no longer even remember your loved ones. You don't remember that you care for them. You don't remember how to move, how to talk, how to do anything. You're just a lump there and you can't do anything. That's what happens right before you die. It starts out with just, just minor loss of memory, and then it gets worse and worse. And memory is involved in everything. There's memory when it comes to movement, when it comes to emotions. And eventually, as you progress through the disease, you lose all of them. If you're not treated, by the way, there are treatments now that can slow it down so that you may outlive Alzheimer's disease and you may die of something else, okay? There's major and minor impairment. The computer image here shows a person whose brain had major impairment. The one on the left, you can see how much the brain has shrunk. And the red there represents plaques and tangles. And you can see the brain with minor impairment on the right. It's bigger, there's less brain atrophy, right? Less plaques and tangles. So the computer graphic shows a vertical slice of a brain ravaged by Alzheimer's disease on the left compared to a similar slice of a normal brain, right? The diseased brain is shrunken because neurons have degenerated, have died and degenerated, right? The red indicates plaques and tangles. The plaques and tangles is what they look for when they do an autopsy, for them to know definitively that this person had Alzheimer's. My grandfather might have had it, by the way. He died a few years ago, and in his last years, he didn't even remember some of his own children's names. He didn't remember it. He remembered some of them, but there's some whose names he didn't remember. Not that he didn't remember their name. I mean, it's not only their name that he didn't remember. He didn't remember who some of them were. He had some symptoms of Alzheimer's, and they didn't do that autopsy on him. He actually died of something else. I think he had prostate cancer. You live long enough, something's going to get you. But he probably had Alzheimer's, although I doubt they looked into that. Okay. There are also vascular diseases. Okay. Vascular diseases were formerly called vascular or multi-infarct dementia. But vascular diseases are characterized by sporadic, which means that they happen every now and then. They come and go, right? Sporadic and progressive loss of intellectual functioning. Your memory gets worse, then it improves, then it gets worse again, and it comes and goes. You have these problems that seem to come and go. Loss of memory, loss of intellectual functioning caused by repeated infarcts or temporary obstructions of blood flow. Basically, blood flow is being blocked to the brain, and when that happens, some neurons die, the brain gets damaged, and that causes impairments. Sufficient blood flow to the brain, of course, means it's not getting enough nourishment, not getting enough oxygen, and neurons will die. Certain brain areas can become impaired. Of course, if there's a big blockage, severe loss of blood to a certain part of the brain, that whole part of the brain can die, and you can die as a result, or you can have severe brain damage, severe impaired functioning as a result of that, from this vascular disease. It correlates with, again, that gene that's also correlated with Alzheimer's, APOE4. The APOE4 allele, that means a certain form of the gene, okay? For some of the elderly, and it can also be caused by surgery that requires general anesthesia. When you have, certain kinds of surgeries that require they give you certain kinds of anesthesia where they basically put you under, they make you go unconscious. That can also cause decreased blood flow and can cause damage to the brain if you are basically unconscious, or there's basically reduced sensation for a long period of time. It may also cause what it's called transient ischemic attacks or mini strokes. Okay, mini strokes can also be a sign of vascular disease. It basically means there's impaired blood flow to the brain, and that will cause neurons to die, the brain to be damaged, and that will cause memory problems in thinking, all sorts of problems, because the brain, of course, controls all the other things. The progression of two neurocognitive disorders, Alzheimer's and vascular disease. Alzheimer's and vascular disease are both neurocognitive disorders. They're both disorders of the brain that impair cognitive ability. okay? Vascular disease is more due to blood flow, remember, right? And if you look at the chart, you can see that the pattern is different. Vascular disease we have there in the, I think in the burgundy, and the Alzheimer's is that straight black line. You can see that the impairment for Alzheimer's is gradual. It's a straight line that goes down, and your functioning gets worse and worse as your memory gets worse, right? But it's different for vascular disease. Functioning is normal, and then there's a big decline. Maybe you got some mini stroke or something, some impaired blood flow. And then what happens is the brain recovers and you get a little bit better. And then it levels out, and then you have another little mini stroke, another impairment, and then it gets worse, and then it improves and gets worse, and it goes up and down a little bit. But overall, it does get worse and worse. Although it seems that the brain recovers a little bit, and then it gets worse, then recovers. That's what happens when there's a decreased blood flow. The brain becomes damaged. There's a little bit of repair, and then there's some more decreased blood flow, and then there's some more damage, and there's a different progression. It's not a straight line. So victims of Alzheimer's disease show steady, gradual decline, while those that suffer from vascular disease suddenly get worse, then they improve, then they get worse again, and then they improve again. Prevalence of neurocognitive disorders. So how often does this happen? Frontotemporal neurocognitive disorders, right, is deterioration of the frontal lobes and the amygdala, okay? So basically there's damage to those parts of the brain. It may be a cause of about 15% of all neurocognitive disorders. So the neurocognitive disorders are the disorders that basically impair thinking, impair thought, right, that have to do with the brain. About 15% of them are frontotemporal neurocognitive disorders. And they tend to occur before age 70, okay? It can be characterized by emotional and personality changes, okay? Changes in compassion, self-awareness, and judgment. And this can be quite sad when you're taking care of somebody who's elderly and they have this problem where they can suddenly, their emotional tone of the behavior and their personality can change. And what happens is they can develop less compassion. Even though you're taking care of them, you feel they should be grateful and be nice to you, they can actually be quite mean and seem to be really awful because they're emotionally, they change, their personality can change, right? You no longer have your sweet old grandmother. Now she seems to be this person that doesn't seem to give a damn and seems to be really mean. That's what can happen with these disorders, right? Self-awareness can change and judgment fade. I mean, where they no longer are too concerned about themselves, not too aware about themselves, may walk out of the room half naked, or not groom themselves, not take care of themselves. Their judgment, all that stuff fades. And basically you can have a really mean, half-dressed, very disheveled grandma, right? Or grandpa, right? If you see people like that, that might be why, okay? But it's a sad thing, but yes, emotionally, your personality, your ability to, make judgments, to take care of yourself, be aware, all that stuff, fades with these frontotemporal neurocognitive disorders. Causes of these frontotemporal neurocognitive disorders, there's many, okay? They may be due to Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is another disease that can lead to problems like this. Multiple sclerosis can also result in problems like this. Severe head injuries from playing football, okay, especially if paid professionally, or maybe you were a boxer. If you're a boxer, professional boxer, or even if you're not professional, but you're a boxer, you box regularly, you're going to get blows to the head, and over time, that's going to damage your brain. Okay. Later stages of syphilis, if you have that disease, the later stages will cause problems like this. AIDS can also cause problems like this. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, otherwise known as mad cow disease, can also cause problems like this. Can cause frontotemporal neurocognitive disorders. Other disorders that can result in these problems: Parkinson's disease. It doesn't always lead to these problems, right? Parkinson's disease usually starts with just rigidity, difficulty with movement, right? Or tremors in the muscles, right? Unable to control them, that are due to basically losses in dopamine, that neurotransmitter. Younger adults with Parkinson's disease may avoid cognitive problems for years. They may not show cognitive problems until they're much older, but Parkinson's disease is also related to this. Also something known as Lewy body disease, named after round deposits of protein. There's these round deposits of protein called Lewy bodies that are found on neurons. Numerous and dispersed throughout the brain. There could be many in the brain, and they will impair movement. So they'll cause motor impairment, motor movement, and cognition are impaired. Also affect your ability to remember, ability to think, right? The main symptom is loss of inhibition. Inhibition, remember, is when you basically stop yourself from doing certain things. If you're mad and you stop yourself from hurting someone, or let's say you just met someone and you shouldn't trust them and you inhibit yourself, you shouldn't go out with them, have sex with them, right? That's inhibition, right? But if you have a lot of these things, the Lewy body disease, you have a lot of these, round deposit proteins on your neurons, that impairs movement. It will impair basically your ability to control yourself, to inhibit yourself. And you may engage in more impulsive behavior because of that. Prevalence of neurocognitive disorders. So how often does this happen? So most elderly people will never experience a neurocognitive disorder. It's important to realize that though we're talking about this, most people will be healthy and will not have these problems. Among people in their 70s, about 1 in 20, about 5% will have a neurocognitive disorder. And even by age 90 or 100, most people will still think well enough and will not have these problems. But you can see prevalence of major neurocognitive disorders after age 70. So in your 70s, it's 5% for neurocognitive disorders, lower for vascular disease, a little bit higher for Alzheimer's disease. And the older you get, the more the incidence increases, right? Look at 80 to 89, 90 plus, how much it increases. The older you get, the more your brain, the more likely it is that you're going to develop a problem. But it's still less than half of people that will have a neurocognitive disorder or Alzheimer's or vascular disease. But yes, the older you get, the greater the chances that you're going to have some impairment. And you're going to die of something. Something's going to get you in the end. Okay, it just might not be one of those things. It might be something else like prostate cancer if you're male, or or some other type of cancer. Preventing impairment. So what can you do to prevent impairment, to lessen your chances of getting these problems? Severe brain damage cannot be reversed. So if you have a big stroke and big part of your brain dies, you can't really do anything about that. But the rate of decline and some symptoms can be treated. If you do have a little mini stroke here and there, right, or you have some developing symptoms of Alzheimer's or of cognitive disorders, right, there are things that can be done to slow down the decline, or things that can be done to actually basically reduce your risk of having this. Okay, there's declining risk of neurocognitive disorders in high-income countries. High-income countries have better, medication, have better healthcare. People are more educated, they're richer, they're more likely to eat healthier, okay, and exercise and things like that. And that is a protective thing. Okay, we talked about that already. Education, exercise, medication, good health habits can ameliorate, in other words, improve, right, on these losses and prevent worse ones. Okay, avoidance of specific pathogens and toxins is critical, right? It's important that you live in a place that doesn't have much pollution, that you're not drinking water that's polluted, okay, or that has certain pathogens, certain, basically organisms that can basically infect you and damage your brain. All that stuff is a factor. Early accurate diagnosis leads to more effective treatment. If your Alzheimer's is diagnosed earlier, right, or the brain problem or the memory problem, whatever it is, if you get to it earlier and you diagnosed earlier, they're more likely to be able to treat it and slow it down, and you can live a better life that way. The problem is that when people start having these symptoms, these problems, most people will be in denial, saying that they're fine, that their memory is fine, they don't have problems. And older people can be basically very stubborn. But if they show symptoms, or if you show symptoms, you need to get checked out. Make sure that you're okay, because the earlier it's diagnosed, the earlier they can treat it, the better off you'll be, and the more they can slow it down. Reversible impairment. Some impairment can be reversible. Accurate diagnosis is crucial when a person is wrongly thought to have a neurocognitive disorder. Sometimes people will be diagnosed with a neurocognitive disorder, but it's actually something else that's causing the problem. And in those cases, they can reverse it and the person can go back to normal. The most common reversible cause of neurocognitive disorder is actually depression. Sometimes people are wrongly classified as having a neurocognitive disorder, when in reality they are depressed, and that's why thinking has slowed, that's why memory is worse. because depression will actually also impair your brain and slow down the brain. But if you get treated and your depression goes away, and remember, there's treatment in the form of therapy, and there's also drug treatment, right? If you treat the depression and then you're not so depressed, or you're not depressed anymore, you won't show those symptoms anymore. It was not a neurocognitive disorder. It was due to depression. But it could also be due to things like malnutrition. You're not eating enough, okay? And your brain isn't getting enough of the nutrients that it needs. Dehydration can cause, also these problems, right? Temporarily. Consumption of alcohol will impair the brain. Brain tumors that can be removed if it's possible. Sometimes they can't remove them because you'll die, because they're in a very important part of the brain. Certain physical illnesses, even over medication can cause symptoms of neurocognitive disorders, where people can be mistakenly diagnosed with these neurocognitive disorders, but it's really something else. They're dehydrated, they're malnourished, they're under the influence of alcohol or other drugs, or they're physically ill, or even just being very tired or sleep deprived. It will impair your memory and your decision making. Even that can be mistaken as being a neurocognitive disorder. With age, bodies become less efficient at digesting food and nutrients. Your body changes as you get older, and your body's not as good as basically at absorbing nutrients and even digesting these nutrients. So that can lead to problems, with nutrition, and it also has to do with problems with drugs as well. There's something known as polypharmacy. Poly means many. It's when elderly people are prescribed several drugs, and the side effects can cause neurocognitive symptoms. They're taking a lot of different drugs, and because of that, it's impairing their brain. Some drug combinations can produce confusion and even psychotic behavior, where they're basically out of touch with reality and delusional, and think they see things and think that things are happening that are not happening. Underuse of medication may also have adverse effects. If you're also on medication for certain things and you forget your medication, like for instance, you're taking medication for schizophrenia or Alzheimer's or something like that, and you forget to take your medication, or you don't take it regularly, well, then you're more likely to have those symptoms, okay, and more likely to have problems that can be signs of neurocognitive disorder. That is it, you guys. That is where we'll stop. I will stop recording.